In the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, Spain emerged as a country exhausted, fractured, and precariously positioned on the European stage. Between 1936 and 1939, nearly 500,000 people had perished, while industrial and agricultural production had collapsed. Francisco Franco, who had consolidated power as head of state, presided over a nation devastated economically and socially, yet ideologically aligned with the authoritarian powers that had supported his victory. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy had provided decisive aid during the Civil War, supplying aircraft, troops, and weapons that tipped the balance in favor of Franco's forces. By 1939, Franco's Spain stood indebted to Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, but also acutely aware of its own fragility. Geopolitically, Spain occupied a position of considerable importance. Its control of the Iberian Peninsula and its proximity to the Strait of Gibraltar gave it strategic leverage over maritime access to the Mediterranean. Britain, with its naval presence in Gibraltar, regarded Spanish alignment with Germany as a direct threat to its lifeline routes through the Mediterranean to Egypt, India, and beyond. Germany, on the other hand, saw potential Spanish entry into the Axis camp as a means to disrupt British logistics and possibly cut off the Royal Navy's access to the Mediterranean altogether. Yet for Franco, the cost of joining the Axis was a central question. Spain lacked the material capacity to wage another war so soon after its civil conflict. Internally, Spain was still reeling from the destruction of the Civil War. Industrial output in 1939 was estimated at only 2/3 of its pre-war levels. Food shortages were widespread, with rationing introduced as agricultural production failed to meet national demand. The armed forces, though battle-hardened from 3 years of civil conflict, were depleted of modern equipment. Many of the tanks and aircraft supplied by Germany and Italy were already outdated by the standards of 1940. Spain could not supply large numbers of modern weapons or ammunition without outside assistance. The logistical foundation for sustained war simply did not exist. At the same time, Franco faced pressure from within his regime. Phalangist elements, particularly those ideologically sympathetic to Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, advocated for closer alignment with the Axis powers. They viewed Spain's role as part of a broader struggle against liberal democracies and communism. Conversely, other factions within Franco's coalition, particularly monarchists and conservatives, favored caution. Their priority was internal stability rather than external entanglement. The Spanish Catholic Church, influential in post-war society, also urged restraint, concerned about the potential destruction a new war could bring to a country still recovering from civil conflict. Public sentiment reflected this uncertainty. While certain sectors of society, especially Phalangist youth and veterans who admired Germany's military victories, expressed enthusiasm for closer ties with Berlin, much of the population remained wary of another war. The memory of devastation between 1936 and 1939 was fresh, and families still bore the scars of fratricidal conflict. The loss of life and economic hardship created a general reluctance among the broader population to see Spain drawn into the global conflagration that erupted in September 1939. Diplomatically, Franco moved carefully in the opening phase of the Second World War. At first, Spain declared itself non-belligerent rather than neutral, echoing Mussolini's stance before Italy formally entered the war in June 1940. This terminology allowed Franco to signal sympathy with the Axis cause without committing military forces. Spain offered material concessions to Germany, including the export of strategic minerals such as tungsten, essential for German armaments production. In return, Berlin extended promises of eventual territorial compensation, particularly in French North Africa, where Franco hoped to expand Spanish influence. Yet, Franco's cautious stance also extended to the Allies. British diplomats worked actively to keep Spain from drifting fully into the Axis orbit, offering economic incentives such as oil deliveries, food supplies, and the maintenance of limited trade. Spain's precarious position was further complicated by its colonial holdings. Spanish Morocco, the Canary Islands, and Equatorial Guinea represented both opportunities and vulnerabilities. German planners considered using Spanish territory as a base for operations against British shipping in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. British intelligence, in turn, monitored these regions closely, aware that any shift in Spanish policy could endanger Allied maritime routes. Franco sought to preserve his leverage by maintaining ambiguity, offering support to Germany in limited forms while avoiding direct confrontation with Britain. Thus, by the end of 1940, Spain stood at a crossroads. The nation was indebted to Germany and Italy, yet economically dependent on supplies from Britain and the United States. Its military capacity was insufficient for major campaigns, but its geographic location rendered it a significant player in the strategic calculations of both Axis and Allied powers. The preconditions for Franco's balancing act were firmly set. Spain would proclaim neutrality, but maneuver within it, extracting concessions while avoiding commitments that could drag the nation into another devastating war. When France fell in June 1940, the strategic balance in Europe shifted dramatically, and with it, Spain's room for maneuver narrowed. Franco faced intense pressure from Adolf Hitler, who sought to capitalize on his victories in Western Europe by drawing Spain into the Axis camp. German planners envisioned operations that would benefit from Spanish cooperation, most notably the assault on Gibraltar, codenamed Operation Felix. Control of Gibraltar would potentially seal the Western Mediterranean, closing Britain's access to the Suez Canal and straining its imperial lifelines. For Hitler, Spain's geographic position was vital. For Franco, the demand threatened to push his fragile country into a war it could not sustain. The meeting between Hitler and Franco at Hendaye on the 23rd of October 1940 epitomized this tension. The German leader arrived with expectations of swift agreement, offering Franco vague promises of territorial expansion in French Morocco, parts of Algeria, and even Cameroon. Franco, however, presented an extensive list of demands before any commitment: hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, oil, weapons, and financial assistance to stabilize Spain's shattered economy. For Hitler, accustomed to rapid compliance from allies and satellites, Franco's hesitation was frustrating. According to accounts, the negotiations dragged on for hours without resolution. In the end, Franco agreed only in principle to eventual cooperation, but withheld any formal commitment to enter the war. This outcome highlighted the divergence between German expectations and Spanish realities. The Wehrmacht, fresh from triumphs in France and preparing for operations against Britain, expected a pliant partner. Spain, however, remained economically dependent on imports, particularly oil, much of which came from the United States. Any move to join the Axis threatened to trigger an Allied blockade, worsening food shortages and risking famine. Britain, through its control of the seas, retained the ability to strangle Spain's already fragile economy. Franco recognized that while German military power was formidable, Britain still possessed tools of coercion that could devastate his regime. Meanwhile, the Allies worked actively to counter German influence in Madrid. British diplomats, backed by the Royal Navy's control of shipping lanes, emphasized the risks Spain would face by aligning too closely with Berlin. Promises of continued supply of food and fuel were made conditional on Spain's neutrality. London also engaged in covert financial measures, channeling funds to ensure pro-Allied influence among key Spanish officials. By maintaining this dual pressure, economic incentives on one hand, potential sanctions on the other, Britain sought to keep Spain from closing Gibraltar or allowing German forces to establish bases on Spanish soil. Within Spain, Franco carefully balanced his rhetoric and actions. He permitted strong pro-Axis propaganda to circulate, presenting his regime as part of a continental struggle against communism and liberal democracy. Volunteers were encouraged to view Germany as a natural ally, particularly after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Yet at the same time, Franco avoided binding treaties that would formally commit Spanish forces beyond symbolic gestures. This strategy of ambiguity allowed him to maintain ideological solidarity with the Axis while minimizing the risk of direct confrontation with Britain and, increasingly, the United States. Public life in Spain reflected this delicate balance. Newspapers carried stories of German victories and often presented the Axis cause favorably, but daily hardships weighed more heavily on ordinary Spaniards. Rationing remained strict, black markets flourished, and unemployment persisted at high levels. the prospect of deeper involvement in a new war generated unease, even among those who admired Germany's strength. Veterans of the Civil War remembered the suffering of prolonged conflict, and the general population remained reluctant to sacrifice further for uncertain gains abroad. Thus, in the period between 1940 and 1941, Spain became a contested diplomatic battleground. Hitler sought to transform Franco's regime into an active ally. Britain and later the United States worked to prevent it. Franco's own policies reflected the precariousness of his position, outward sympathy for the Axis, strategic bargaining for material aid, and careful avoidance of commitments that could tip his country into open war. It was in this context that the next stage of the Spanish gamble emerged, the decision to send volunteers to fight on the Eastern Front, a move designed to appease Hitler while preserving Spain's official neutrality. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on 22 June 1941, the dynamics of Spain's neutrality took a new turn. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union reframed the war as an ideological crusade against communism, which resonated strongly with Franco's regime. The Spanish Civil War had been fought in large part against leftist and communist factions, and the Soviet Union had been the principal foreign supporter of the Republican side. Within Franco's Spain, anti-communism was not merely a political stance, but a core element of the regime's identity. This allowed Franco to present limited participation in the war as a continuation of Spain's domestic struggle, framed as the crusade against Bolshevism. The mechanism through which Spain entered this ideological campaign was the creation of the Division Azul, or Blue Division, named after the blue shirts of the Phalange. Officially designated as the 250th Infantry Division of the German Army, it was formed from Spanish volunteers but integrated into Wehrmacht command structures. Recruitment began in July 1941 and drew tens of thousands of men from various backgrounds, while Phalangists and Civil War veterans formed a significant portion. Economic hardship also motivated many volunteers who saw service as a means of earning wages and securing food. Estimates suggest that around 18,000 men formed the initial contingent sent to Germany for training, with later rotations raising the total number of Spaniards who served on the Eastern Front to approximately 47,000 over the course of the war. For Franco, the Blue Division represented a calculated compromise. It allowed him to demonstrate solidarity with Hitler without formally entering the war. Spain could claim to remain neutral, while insisting that the dispatch of volunteers was a private initiative, not an act of state policy. In practice, however, the government organized recruitment, provided uniforms, and coordinated with German authorities. This blurred line between official neutrality and unofficial participation was central to Franco's strategy. Appease Berlin with manpower for its eastern campaign, but avoid direct conflict with Britain or the Soviet Union on the diplomatic stage. The Blue Division trained in Germany before deployment to the front in October 1941. It was assigned to Army Group North, tasked with supporting the siege of Leningrad. The division's organization followed standard Wehrmacht structure, consisting of 3 infantry regiments, an artillery regiment, and supporting units. Equipment was largely German-supplied, though many Spanish troops retained elements of their own uniform, most notably their blue shirts beneath German field gear. This combination of Spanish and German symbols reflected the hybrid nature of the unit, a national contingent within a foreign army. On the battlefield, the Blue Division endured the same conditions as other Axis units on the Eastern Front. They faced the harsh Russian winter of 1941-42, inadequate supplies, and fierce Soviet resistance. Casualty rates were severe. Of the approximately 47,000 Spaniards who served, around 4,500 were killed, 8,700 wounded, and nearly 300 captured by the Red Army. For many Spaniards, the Eastern Front represented a brutal extension of the ideological struggle they had fought at home, but in an environment far more unforgiving and alien. Letters and reports from the front reveal both pride in resisting communism and deep suffering under the extreme conditions of combat and climate. Diplomatically, the presence of Spanish troops in German service created complications. The Soviet Union protested Spain's involvement, arguing that Franco's regime had abandoned neutrality. Britain and the United States, however, accepted Franco's explanation that these were volunteers rather than a state army. Their priority was to prevent Spain from closing Gibraltar or providing bases for the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe. As long as Spain's contribution remained limited to volunteers, London and Washington tolerated the contradiction. This delicate balance highlighted the limits of Allied leverage. Too much pressure might push Franco closer to Hitler, while too little risked Spain drifting into open Axis alignment. Inside Spain, the Blue Division became a symbol of ideological commitment for the Phalange. State propaganda celebrated the volunteers as the heroes fighting the same enemy that had threatened Spain during the Civil War. Recruitment campaigns emphasized duty, honor, and the defense of Western civilization against communism. Yet, enthusiasm was not universal. Many families, already struggling with poverty and shortages, saw the departure of young men as an additional burden. The war in the East remained distant to much of the population, who were more concerned with surviving the daily challenges of rationing and economic stagnation. Thus, the Blue Division embodied the essence of Franco's gamble. It offered Hitler tangible support while shielding Spain from the full consequences of belligerency. It reinforced Franco's ideological stance while preserving his diplomatic flexibility. For Germany, Spanish volunteers were a welcome addition, but far from decisive in the vast scale of the Eastern Front. For Spain, their presence abroad bought time, allowing Franco to maintain neutrality at home while carefully balancing between the contending powers of a world at war. By 1942, the Spanish gamble became even more complex as the war expanded and the international balance began to shift. The Blue Division remained deployed on the Eastern Front, fighting around Leningrad and along the Volkhov River. But the broader implications of Spain's involvement were unfolding on the diplomatic and economic levels. Franco had to navigate an increasingly delicate situation. Germany still pressed for greater Spanish cooperation, while the Allies intensified their efforts to keep Spain out of the war entirely. The strategic significance of the Iberian Peninsula remained constant. The Axis High Command, particularly the German OKW, continued to view Spain as a potential springboard for operations against Gibraltar and North Africa. Operation Felix, though postponed, was never entirely abandoned in German planning. Yet every serious discussion of Spanish entry into the war stalled on the same obstacle: Spain's inability to sustain itself in wartime conditions. Without oil, coal, and imported food, the country risked collapse. German supplies were insufficient to cover Spain's needs, and Berlin prioritized its own campaigns in the Soviet Union. At the same time, Britain exploited its naval dominance to exert leverage. By controlling the shipping routes that fed Spain, London dictated the flow of crucial imports. In 1942, for instance, Britain and the United States supplied much of the petroleum needed to keep Spanish industry and transport functioning. These shipments came with political strings. Spain was reminded that any overt alignment with Germany would lead to the immediate suspension of oil deliveries, plunging the country into paralysis. The Allies also controlled the export of wheat and other foodstuffs, further deepening Spanish dependency. Economically, Spain maintained an ambiguous relationship with both sides. To Germany, it exported strategic raw materials, most importantly, tungsten, a critical element for hardening steel used in tank armor and artillery shells. German industry relied heavily on Iberian tungsten, and Spanish mines in Galicia and Portugal's neighboring deposits became hotly contested. At the same time, Spain exported goods to Britain, including iron ore and food, thereby preserving a level of cooperation with the Allies. This dual system of trade allowed Franco to extract benefits from both camps while keeping his options open. Within Spain, the presence of the Blue Division on the Eastern Front was increasingly emphasized in propaganda as proof of Spain's commitment to the anti-communist struggle. Newspapers reported on battles and decorated returning soldiers, while ceremonies honored those killed in action. Yet beneath the official narrative, the burden was significant. Casualty lists mounted, and veterans returned with stories of the brutal Russian winters, the strength of the Red Army, and the heavy toll of fighting in distant and alien landscapes. By mid-1942, it was clear that Spain's symbolic contribution, while sufficient to placate Hitler, brought little tangible reward in return. Franco also had to manage the delicate internal balance of his regime. The Phalange continued to advocate for stronger ties with Germany, seeing in the Axis cause the ideological fulfillment of Spain's civil conflict. Military officers, too, often admired German efficiency and battlefield success, though some recalled the strategic dangers of overcommitment. Conversely, monarchists, technocrats, and moderates urged Franco to avoid entanglement. Their concern lay in preserving Spain's independence and ensuring survival beyond the war. Franco, cautious and pragmatic, leaned increasingly toward their advice as the tide of war began to turn. The Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942, Operation Torch, further complicated the situation. With American and British troops establishing a presence directly across from Spanish Morocco, the risk of Spain becoming a battlefield increased. Germany responded by occupying Vichy France, extending its direct presence to the Pyrenees. For Franco, this development underscored the danger of allowing Spain to appear too closely aligned with Berlin. A German invasion of the peninsula was conceivable, but an Allied intervention in North Africa was already reality. Spain's geographic position was now sandwiched between rival powers, both capable of applying pressure. Diplomatically, Franco intensified his balancing act. He reassured Hitler of Spain's loyalty to the anti-communist cause, while simultaneously assuring Britain and the United States that Spain had no intention of abandoning neutrality. Spanish ambassadors in London and Washington emphasized Spain's restraint, while Madrid cultivated secret contacts to demonstrate goodwill. This policy of calculated ambiguity allowed Franco to preserve Spanish sovereignty, while continuing to extract economic concessions from both sides. By late 1942, the Spanish gamble was reaching its most delicate phase. The Blue Division remained at the front, tying Spain to Germany's war effort in symbolic fashion. Yet the economic and diplomatic survival of Spain depended increasingly on the goodwill of the Allies. Franco's regime had succeeded in avoiding outright entry into the war, but the price was a constant balancing of contradictory commitments. Each decision required weighing immediate gains against long-term survival, and each step risked alienating one of the two great power blocs vying for influence over the Iberian Peninsula. In 1943, the international situation underwent decisive changes, and with them, Franco's diplomatic maneuvering became more urgent. The turning of the tide on the Eastern Front, marked by the Soviet victory at Stalingrad in February, demonstrated that Germany's advance was not unstoppable. At the same time, the Anglo-American forces consolidated their presence in North Africa and prepared for the invasion of Italy. Spain, still officially neutral but bound to Germany through the presence of the Blue Division, found itself in a precarious position. The Blue Division's operations in 1943 reflected this shift. Stationed around Leningrad and engaged in defensive operations along the Volkhov and later the Imga front, the division experienced sustained combat as Soviet counteroffensives intensified. Spanish troops endured heavy casualties in battles such as Krasny Bor in February 1943, where approximately 5,600 men faced a Soviet force of around 38,000. Though they held their positions for some time, the cost was severe. Nearly half the division's strength was lost in killed, wounded, or captured. For Germany, this sacrifice was welcome proof of Spain's commitment. For Spain, it was an increasingly difficult burden to justify. The United States now entered the picture with growing weight. Washington, unlike London, had not previously been the primary actor in managing Spanish neutrality. But as American forces advanced into the Mediterranean, President Roosevelt and his administration considered Spain's future alignment critical. U.S. diplomats warned Madrid that continued cooperation with Germany could result in sanctions or even military measures. At the same time, the United States supplied vital quantities of grain and petroleum, demonstrating its capacity to support or undermine Spain's economy. Economic dependency defined Spain's policy. By 1943, Germany was less able to provide resources, as its war effort consumed increasing amounts of raw materials. Spain's tungsten exports to Germany continued, but these too came under Allied pressure. Britain and the United States threatened to cut off food and fuel unless tungsten shipments were reduced. In some cases, the Allies even purchased Spanish tungsten at inflated prices simply to deny it to Germany. This resource war highlighted the way in which Spain's economy became a tool in the wider conflict, with Franco leveraging scarcity to extract concessions from both sides. Domestically, the political climate was shifting as well. The Falange remained committed to the Axis, but other elements within the regime recognized that Germany's prospects were diminishing. Franco carefully distanced himself from overtly pro-German policies, even while continuing to permit propaganda in support of the Blue Division. By mid-1943, discussions began within the regime about the possibility of recalling Spanish troops from the Eastern Front, a step that would signal Spain's gradual pivot away from Berlin. Internationally, Spain's position grew more complex with the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent collapse of Mussolini's regime in Italy. Fascist Italy had been Franco's closest ideological partner, and its downfall demonstrated the fragility of Axis power. For Hitler, this was a further reason to demand loyalty from Franco. For Franco, it was a stark reminder of what could happen to regimes too closely tied to the fortunes of Germany. He increasingly saw neutrality not just as a shield, but as the only viable path for Spain's survival. Public opinion mirrored these shifts. While the Blue Division was still celebrated in official media, reports of heavy casualties and prisoners of war could not be concealed. Families of soldiers became critical of the government's policy, and ordinary Spaniards, already facing rationing and shortages, grew less enthusiastic about sacrifices made for Germany's war. Veterans returning from the Eastern Front recounted the brutal conditions, further dampening enthusiasm. By 1943, support for closer ties with Germany was largely limited to the most ideologically committed factions, while the broader population leaned toward disengagement. Thus, 1943 represented a transitional year for Spain. The country continued to contribute to Germany's war effort through manpower and resources, but the strategic balance was changing rapidly. Franco increasingly emphasized Spain's neutrality in diplomatic contacts, reassured the Allies of his independence, and prepared the groundwork for reducing visible ties to the Axis. The Spanish gamble, once a delicate balance, now evolved into a gradual but deliberate repositioning, ensuring that Spain would not be drawn into the collapsing fortunes of the Axis powers. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Spanish gamble reached a decisive phase. The military and diplomatic landscape of the war had shifted irreversibly, and Franco's regime was compelled to adapt. The Soviet Union's continued advance on the Eastern Front, the Allied victories in Italy, and the preparation for an invasion of Western Europe underscored Germany's declining prospects. Spain, tied to Berlin through the Blue Division and economic exchanges, could no longer ignore the risk of association with a losing side. The fate of the Blue Division became central to this recalibration. After the bloody fighting at Krasny Bor and subsequent engagements, its continued presence on the Eastern Front was both politically and militarily costly. By the summer of 1943, discussions inside Madrid focused on how to withdraw Spanish forces without provoking Hitler's anger. In October 1943, under mounting Allied pressure, Franco officially announced the recall of the Blue Division. The decision was presented as a sovereign assertion of neutrality, but it was also a signal to Washington and London that Spain was pivoting toward a more cautious stance. Yet the withdrawal was not absolute. While the main body of the Blue Division returned home, a group of volunteers, later referred to as the Blue Legion, remained in German service, numbering roughly 4,000 men. These troops continued to fight under Wehrmacht command until early 1944, before being disbanded as well. The persistence of this smaller contingent reflected the enduring influence of pro-Axis sentiment within certain circles of the regime, as well as Franco's desire to avoid a complete rupture with Hitler. Still, the recall of the larger force marked a turning point. Spain was clearly distancing itself from active collaboration. Economically, Spain deepened its balancing act. German demands for tungsten remained insistent, but Allied pressure grew more effective. In early 1944, the United States and Britain issued direct warnings that continued tungsten exports to Germany would trigger severe sanctions, including the suspension of oil and grain shipments. With Spain's economy still heavily dependent on foreign imports, Franco had little choice but to yield. By May 1944, Madrid agreed to drastically reduce tungsten sales to Germany, a concession that further aligned Spain with the Allied economic war effort. Diplomatic contacts between Spain and the Western Allies intensified. The United States, recognizing Spain's strategic location, sought to prevent German use of the Iberian Peninsula as a fallback position should the Reich collapse. Washington also began to view Spain as a potential partner in the emerging post-war order, provided that Franco demonstrated clear independence from Berlin. In January 1944, the Allies secured assurances that Spain would not permit German troops to cross its territory or establish bases on Spanish soil. This commitment was critical in Allied planning for the forthcoming invasion of France. Domestically, the regime adjusted its narrative to match the changing tides. Propaganda gradually shifted from celebrating Spain's military contribution in Russia to emphasizing the country's role as a stabilizing, neutral force in a world at war. Official rhetoric stressed that Spain had already fulfilled its duty against communism through the Blue Division, but the national survival now required staying out of further conflict. Veterans returning from the Eastern Front were honored, but the focus was increasingly on national reconstruction and stability rather than ideological crusades abroad. The population, meanwhile, continued to endure hardship. Rationing persisted, black markets thrived, and malnutrition remained a serious problem in many regions. The return of thousands of wounded and disabled veterans added to the social burden. Yet, Franco's decision to recall the Blue Division was generally welcomed, as it meant fewer families would lose sons to a distant war. The memory of the Civil War still weighed heavily, and the majority of Spaniards preferred neutrality to renewed sacrifice. Germany's reaction to Spain's withdrawal was one of disappointment, but not outright hostility. Hitler, by 1943-44, was increasingly consumed by the crises on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean. While he resented Franco's decision, he lacked the resources to punish Spain or coerce it into fuller cooperation. German diplomats tried to maintain influence in Madrid, but the reality was that Spain was slipping steadily from the Axis orbit. Thus, by 1944, Spain's role had shifted from ambiguous cooperation toward cautious disengagement. The recall of the Blue Division, the curtailing of tungsten exports, and the cultivation of stronger ties with the Allies all pointed in the same direction. Franco was positioning his regime for survival in a post-war world where the Axis was no longer expected to prevail. The gamble that had defined Spanish policy since 1939 was entering its final stage, shaped by the need to navigate the collapse of Germany while preserving Spain's sovereignty and the regime's authority at home. In 1944, Spain's cautious disengagement from the Axis was tested by both internal pressures and external expectations. The Allies, now firmly in control of North Africa and advancing through Italy, expected clearer evidence of Spanish neutrality. At the same time, Germany, facing collapse on multiple fronts, leaned harder on Franco to demonstrate loyalty. The Spanish leadership had to adapt quickly, ensuring survival while avoiding reprisals from either side. The aftermath of the Blue Division's recall left a lingering legacy. Veterans, numbering in the tens of thousands, returned home with stories of combat on the Russian front. While some were celebrated in public ceremonies, others expressed bitterness at the heavy losses and lack of clear purpose. Propaganda framed them as defenders of European civilization, but privately, many families questioned why Spain had been drawn into a distant war. This social tension created a subtle but noticeable divide: those who still championed Germany's cause and those who sought to distance the nation from further sacrifice. Diplomatic maneuvering became central to Franco's survival strategy. In early 1944, the Spanish government tightened restrictions on German agents and curtailed overtly pro-Axis propaganda. While Madrid continued to allow German intelligence networks to operate, their scope was increasingly limited under Allied pressure. Simultaneously, Spain offered quiet cooperation to the Allies, sharing information about German shipping movements and assuring them that Spanish territory would not be made available for Axis operations. This dual policy demonstrated Franco's ability to play both sides, but it also required constant adjustment to avoid provoking retaliation. The question of tungsten remained a persistent flashpoint. German industry still depended heavily on Spanish supplies. But by 1944, Allied diplomacy and economic leverage reached a breaking point. Washington and London threatened to impose a full oil embargo if tungsten exports continued at previous levels. Franco, recognizing the vulnerability of Spain's transport and agriculture without imported fuel, conceded. By mid-1944, tungsten exports to Germany had been severely restricted, an act that signaled Spain's realignment more clearly than rhetoric could. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 further shifted calculations. With Germany under direct assault in Western Europe, the prospect of an Axis victory had effectively vanished. Spanish diplomats in Washington emphasized Spain's restraint during the critical months of the invasion, pointing out that no German reinforcements or supplies had passed through the Iberian Peninsula. For the Allies, keeping Spain cooperative was a strategic necessity. Gibraltar had to remain secure, and any disruption in the Western Mediterranean could complicate their supply lines. Domestically, Franco's regime emphasized stability and sovereignty. Official propaganda shifted tone, stressing Spain's role as a non-belligerent power that had avoided the devastation consuming the rest of Europe. The image of Franco as the cautious guardian of Spanish independence became central to his legitimacy. While veterans of the Blue Division were still honored, public messaging increasingly downplayed ongoing links to Germany. Instead, the regime highlighted Spain's avoidance of bombing, invasion, and occupation, contrasting the relative calm of Madrid and Barcelona with the ruins of Warsaw, Rome, or Berlin. Still, pro-German factions within the Falange continued to agitate for stronger support of the Axis cause. Some saw Spain's retreat from open collaboration as a betrayal of ideological solidarity, yet Franco, pragmatic above all, prioritized survival over ideological consistency. By late 1944, with German armies retreating on both the eastern and western fronts, his policy of selective disengagement was vindicated. Spain had offered symbolic support, but avoided direct entanglement. For Germany, Spain's reduced cooperation was a disappointment, but not a decisive blow. The Reich's leadership recognized by then that Spain could not be compelled without an invasion, and resources for such a campaign no longer existed. Spanish volunteers who remained on the Eastern Front fought on in dwindling numbers, but they represented an ideological remnant rather than a strategic asset. Thus, by the end of 1944, Spain stood increasingly aligned with the Allies in practice, if not in public declarations. The gamble had shifted once more, from avoiding entry into the war to preparing for its aftermath. Franco now faced a new challenge, ensuring that Spain, though tainted by past collaboration, would not be treated as an enemy state once the Axis collapsed. The next phase would demand careful positioning in a world already looking ahead to peace negotiations and post-war order. By early 1945, the collapse of the Axis was no longer in doubt, and Spain's gamble entered its most critical stage. Franco now faced the urgent task of dissociating his regime from the defeated powers while safeguarding the political order he had built since the Civil War. The stakes were high. If the Allies chose to treat Spain as a collaborator, the regime risked isolation, sanctions, or even military intervention in the post-war settlement. The final months of the war underscored the narrowing of Spain's options. Germany, once seen as the guarantor of Spain's ideological allies, was now fighting a desperate rearguard on both the eastern and western fronts. Communications between Berlin and Madrid became increasingly strained. German diplomats pressed for renewed cooperation, but Franco responded with evasions. Requests for tungsten shipments or logistical assistance were quietly refused. Spanish officials even began seizing German property in Spain, signaling a decisive shift toward appeasing the Allies. One of Franco's most important moves was the formal disbandment of remaining Spanish units still serving under German command. The so-called Blue Legion, already reduced in size by 1944, was ordered to dissolve entirely. A number of Spaniards chose to remain with German forces as individuals, later fighting in Waffen-SS or Wehrmacht formations until the end of the war. Their presence, however, was disavowed by Madrid, which increasingly insisted that Spain had no official role in the global conflict. This narrative, distancing the state from the volunteers, became central to Franco's diplomatic strategy. Allied diplomats scrutinized Spain's position closely. In 1945, as the Yalta Conference shaped the future of Europe, Spain was excluded from discussions due to its past associations with the Axis. Both Roosevelt and Churchill regarded Franco's regime with suspicion, while Stalin considered it openly hostile. Yet none of the Allied leaders wished to destabilize the Iberian Peninsula at a moment when resources were committed to final operations against Germany and Japan. The Allies' strategy became one of political pressure rather than direct confrontation. Economically, Spain struggled to maintain even basic stability. Wartime shortages had left the country impoverished, with rationing still widespread and industrial production sluggish. Allied restrictions on trade further limited recovery, as Spain's ambiguous wartime record made it difficult to secure international credit. Nevertheless, Franco sought to emphasize the benefits of neutrality. Unlike much of Europe, Spain's cities were not in ruins, and its infrastructure had largely survived the war intact. This argument would later become central to Spain's appeal for acceptance in the emerging post-war order. Internally, Franco's propaganda apparatus redefined the narrative of the war. Whereas earlier years had emphasized solidarity with Germany in the anti-communist struggle, by 1945 the focus shifted to Spain's restraint and independence. Official statements stressed that Spain had resisted pressure from both sides and preserved peace within its borders. The Blue Division was remembered as a symbolic gesture, but the regime increasingly portrayed neutrality as its true guiding principle. This reinterpretation aimed to prepare the ground for post-war legitimacy, portraying Franco as a statesman who had kept his nation out of catastrophe. At the same time, Spain sought discreet rapprochement with the Allies. Contacts with American and British diplomats emphasized Madrid's usefulness as a stable partner in the Western Mediterranean. With the onset of tensions between the Soviet Union and the West already visible, Franco calculated that his fierce anti-communism could soon transform from a liability into an asset. In this way, he began positioning Spain for survival in the New World Order that was emerging even before the guns fell silent in Europe. Thus, by the spring of 1945, the Spanish gamble had reached its decisive conclusion. Franco had succeeded in maintaining official neutrality, avoided direct invasion or blockade, and preserved his regime at a time when many Axis-aligned governments collapsed. Yet Spain's ambiguous record left it isolated, distrusted by the Allies, and excluded from the immediate post-war community. The coming years would determine whether Franco's careful balancing act had truly secured Spain's long-term survival, or merely postponed an inevitable reckoning with the consequences of its wartime choices. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Spain stood apart as a peculiar survivor. It had not participated directly in the conflict as a belligerent, yet it had contributed tens of thousands of volunteers to the Axis cause and maintained an ambiguous alignment with Germany until the very end. The defeat of the Axis left Franco's regime diplomatically isolated, facing hostility from victorious Allied governments and suspicion from global opinion. The challenge now was to navigate the immediate aftermath, preserving the regime at home while avoiding punitive measures abroad. The Allies' initial response was cautious but firm. At the San Francisco Conference in April 1945, where the United Nations was founded, Spain was explicitly excluded. The reason cited was its association with fascist regimes and its lack of democratic legitimacy. This exclusion symbolized Spain's pariah status in the new international order. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all regarded Franco as a relic of the authoritarian systems that had plunged Europe into war. Stalin, in particular, pressed for Spain's international isolation, describing Franco's regime as a remnant of fascism that had escaped destruction. Economic consequences quickly followed. Spain's wartime trade with Germany had already declined, and with the Axis defeat, it lost a key partner. The Allies tightened restrictions on exports to Spain, limiting access to vital raw materials and finished goods. The continuation of rationing and shortages underlined the fragility of Spain's post-war economy. At the same time, Franco's government launched initiatives to present Spain as a stabilizing force. Officials emphasized that Spain had avoided devastation, maintained order, and preserved independence when much of Europe lay in ruins. This argument, however, had little resonance abroad in 1945, when memories of Franco's ties to Hitler and Mussolini were still fresh. Domestically, Franco consolidated power in the aftermath of the war. The repression of political opposition continued, with communists, socialists, and Republican exiles facing surveillance, imprisonment, or execution. The regime also sought to control the narrative of Spain's wartime policy. Propaganda now emphasized that Spain had remained neutral despite enormous pressure from both sides, portraying Franco as a prudent leader who had steered the country away from catastrophe. The Blue Division was still honored, but increasingly in the context of a broader narrative of defending Western civilization rather than of serving Hitler's war aims. Internationally, Spain's survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance during the first years of peace. Britain and the United States, though suspicious of Franco, recognized that destabilizing Spain risked creating a vacuum in the Iberian Peninsula at a time when Europe was already in crisis. Their policy was therefore one of controlled pressure, political and economic isolation without outright intervention. This allowed Franco to consolidate domestically while searching for avenues of eventual reintegration. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union maintained a hard line. Moscow supported Spanish Republican exiles, many of whom were concentrated in France, and promoted campaigns for international action against Franco. The Soviet position hardened Spain's exclusion from early post-war forums, including the United Nations. Yet this isolation also created an opening. As the wartime alliance fractured and the Cold War emerged, Spain's anti-communism began to appear useful to the Western powers. The return of veterans from the Blue Division further complicated the domestic picture. Many were celebrated as heroes in official ceremonies, but they also carried the stigma of association with the defeated Axis. Some veterans faced difficulties reintegrating, while others became symbols for hardline phalangists who still lamented Spain's incomplete participation in the war. Franco's regime managed this by allowing commemoration, while carefully reframing the division's role as part of Spain's unique contribution to the struggle against communism, not as evidence of submission to Hitler. By 1945 and 1946, Spain's gamble had succeeded in preserving national sovereignty and the regime itself, but at the cost of near-total diplomatic isolation. The Allies had little interest in overthrowing Franco, but neither were they willing to legitimize him in the immediate post-war order. Spain remained outside major reconstruction programs, such as the Marshall Plan, and its economy stagnated as a result. Yet the seeds of survival had been planted. Franco's calculation that Spain's neutrality would preserve his regime long enough for the international situation to shift proved correct as the Cold War loomed. In this transitional moment, Spain's official position was one of defensive justification, stressing neutrality, sovereignty, and stability. The international community, however, largely regarded it as a dictatorship that had escaped accountability. The coming years would test whether Franco's careful wartime maneuvering could be translated into long-term survival in a world dominated by two new superpowers. The Spanish gamble was not yet over. It was entering a new phase shaped not by Hitler or Churchill, but by the rivalry of Washington and Moscow. The legacy of Franco's neutrality gamble unfolded over decades, shaping Spain's place in post-war Europe and its internal political trajectory. While 1945 left Spain ostracized, the shifting dynamics of the Cold War soon transformed Franco from an isolated dictator into a tolerated, even useful ally for the Western Bloc. This transformation demonstrated the long-term significance of his wartime balancing act. By keeping Spain officially neutral, Franco preserved the state and regime at a moment when other authoritarian governments in Europe were swept away. The immediate years after the war were marked by condemnation and exclusion. In December 1946, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution branding Franco's government as fascist in origin and calling for its diplomatic isolation. Member states were urged to withdraw ambassadors, and Spain found itself shut out of international institutions. Economically, this meant limited access to trade and credit, deepening the shortages and stagnation that already plagued the country. Internally, however, Franco used the siege mentality to reinforce control. Propaganda framed Spain as a victim of international hypocrisy, punished for maintaining order and neutrality, while others had waged destructive wars. The turning point came with the intensification of East-West rivalry. As the Soviet Union consolidated its hold over Eastern Europe and communist movements gained influence in Western Europe, Spain's vehement anti-communism gained new relevance. By the late 1940s, Washington began to reconsider Spain, not as a pariah, but as a potential partner in the struggle against Moscow. Britain, too, despite its historic suspicion of Franco, recognized the strategic importance of the Iberian Peninsula in controlling access to the Mediterranean and safeguarding Atlantic routes. This gradual shift culminated in the 1950s. In 1953, Spain signed the Pact of Madrid with the United States, securing American military and economic aid in exchange for the establishment of U.S. bases on Spanish soil. That same year, Franco concluded a concordat with the Vatican, strengthening his legitimacy in Catholic circles. By 1955, Spain was admitted to the United Nations, ending a decade of diplomatic ostracism. Franco had achieved what many thought impossible in 1945, full reintegration into the international community without abandoning his authoritarian system. Domestically, the regime used this new international legitimacy to consolidate itself further. Veterans of the Blue Division were gradually absorbed into national narratives of sacrifice, but their association with Germany was reframed as a contribution to the wider defense of Europe against communism. The Civil War and the wartime neutrality became twin pillars of the regime's legitimacy. Franco presented himself as the man who had both defeated Marxism at home and shielded Spain from destruction abroad. This narrative, while contested in exile communities and among opposition groups, proved durable for decades. The economic consequences of wartime neutrality were more ambiguous. Excluded from the Marshall Plan, Spain missed the rapid post-war reconstruction experienced by Western Europe. Its economy stagnated through the 1940s, marked by rationing, black markets, and limited industrial growth. Only with the gradual opening to U.S. aid and foreign investment in the 1950s did Spain begin to experience sustained modernization. Franco's gamble had preserved sovereignty, but at the cost of delaying Spain's recovery by nearly a decade compared to its neighbors. Internationally, Spain's ambiguous wartime role continued to generate debate. Some historians emphasize the regime's complicity with the Axis through the Blue Division and strategic trade, while others highlighted its refusal to enter the war formally as decisive for preserving Gibraltar and maintaining Allied control of the Western Mediterranean. For Spaniards themselves, memory was divided. For veterans and phalangists, the Blue Division was a point of pride. For Republicans in exile, it symbolized betrayal and repression. The contested legacy reflected the multiple dimensions of Franco's policy, part ideological solidarity, part pragmatic survival. In the long term, Franco's neutrality gamble proved successful in one crucial respect. It secured the continuity of his regime until his death in 1975. Unlike Mussolini, who was overthrown and executed, or Hitler, who perished in defeat, Franco outlived the Second World War by 3 decades, ruling Spain until the country's transition to democracy. His decision to avoid full commitment to the Axis insulated Spain from occupation, devastation, and forced regime change. Yet it also ensured that Spain remained on the margins of post-war Europe until Cold War geopolitics brought it back into the fold. The Spanish gamble, therefore, was not simply a wartime policy, but a long-term strategy of survival. By sending the Blue Division to appease Hitler, Franco bought time and flexibility. By recalling it and restricting German trade, he reassured the Allies. By insisting on neutrality, he preserved sovereignty. The costs were high in terms of international isolation, economic hardship, and moral compromise. But the outcome was clear. Spain remained intact when the Axis collapsed. In this way, Franco's Spain illustrates the complexity of wartime neutrality, neither passive nor absolute, but a constant negotiation shaped by shifting pressures, calculated risks, and the pursuit of regime survival above all else.